Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I am co-host number two, Terry Barnes. And as always, we are the art and science of the Viking Age. And CJ,
Yeah.
yeah, before we introduce our guest, I'm kind of sad. Like we're now at the end of an era, as it were, because this is going to be our last podcast together where we can say that we're both in Oregon.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm
Uh,
moving.
He's
I'm
moving to France, as some of people will know if they are regular watchers or listeners. But I mean, we're going to continue, but we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus here until September to give you a chance to get settled and everything. But yeah, we've almost done 50 episodes together in this way, so it's kind of sad a little bit. But
I'll have a presence here, but I'm as I like to tell people, I'm getting out of here before the whole thing burns down. As you can see, I'm in Sunriver now, and look at that. That is just a tinderbox waiting to go up. Even my mom, I'm at my mom's house, and even she's like, I'm probably gonna sell and knock on wood that they almost burned down last year.
yeah,
So it's just a matter of time, and that's what the insurance companies are saying is it's just a matter of time, and they're pulling out. Like the neighbors lost their insurance, and now they're trying to find somebody else. And anyway, it's interesting. So we're gonna move somewhere where it's a little more stable.
yeah, and actually, well, for people who maybe know or don't know, I mean, we live in the west of the United States, and it's just it's become increasingly perilous in recent years with climate change and everything. And even our good friend of the show, Jesse Byock, I talked to him last week, and his how he lost everything in the Pacific Palisades fire down in LA earlier this year. So
Oh
the
yeah,
West is just every year now, people have to deal with either they're losing their things or living with eternal smoke in the air. So it's bad.
yeah, yeah. So far this year though, still clear. So
Yeah.
we're
Good.
middle of June. This time last year we were already smoked in. So knock on wood, it keeps going. Fourth of July though is
Yeah.
when all the rednecks go out and shoot off their fireworks in the middle of the national forest, and that's when things get really heated. So
Yeah.
that's the other problem we have.
Yeah. On that note,
Sorry, not to disparage anyone, but that's what happens every year. Anyway,
yeah.
but our guest today is not here to talk about forest fires, but rather someone we encountered through a news study that was published quite recently this year on skull manipulation. And I wrote a blog about it, and then we reached out to see if he'd like to come on the show. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Martin Rundqvist. He's associate research professor at the University of Łódź, although he mentioned that he is currently in Sweden. So change a little bit of a switch up there. And while we did meet him through the study that he did on skull manipulation, which we will talk about, I imagine we have a lot more fun things that we could discuss with him today. So, Dr. Rundqvist, welcome to Vikingology.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
So let's start with the skull manipulation. Terry mentioned before we started recording that it's going to be hard to make jokes about skulls. Therefore, I commit to making at least three during this podcast. We're going to make it. Starting with the title of my blog, which is No, they did not drink out of the skulls of their enemies. What they did do was weirder. So would
So
you so first feel free to start off with a little bit of an introduction about yourself, where you're at, what you're currently looking at, and then let's jump into what were those weird things the Vikings were doing with skulls.
Well, I'm a Swedish prehistorian and medievalist, and I've been working mainly with research for 30 years now. And the Viking period is one of my favorite periods. I've been working extensively with it. I'm sort of a short bike ride and a canoe trip from Birka outside of Stockholm. So I'm in Viking country here. And I came across several funny finds where there was this human head just sitting in pieces in a situation where you wouldn't expect it. And I kept collecting those unexpected things over the years until I realized that these are getting so many that this is not just exceptions from rules. This is starting to look like a rule. Last year, I spent several months digging through the literature and finding more and more cases. And it's clear that a lot of them represent murdering slaves at the graveside. So many people will sort of think of it as human sacrifice, but historians of religion, they're very, very adamant about sacrifice is when you give something to a god. This is not sacrifice. This is just killing somebody and putting them as a grave furnishing in somebody else's grave. So grandpa might have been this really rich man. We'll give him a sword and a pot of food and a horse and some travel gear, and we'll also give him his favorite slave. So they'll decapitate this person, and occasionally they will put the whole guy into the grave, occasionally just the head, very, very rarely just the body, which is weird. But still, that's one clear source of these unexpected extra heads in or near burials. And another quite common situation is that we will find them in what looks like sacrificial environments. And then we are in what historians of religion call sacrifice, where you dip a head or a skull into a holy well or a holy stream or lake. But you get the weirdest things. Like I got this site I excavated a few years ago where they tore down a big gold mead hall that had been 50 meters long, and they re-landscaped the platform it had been sitting on with a nice, neat layer of stones on top. And in that stone layer, they just strew fragments of human skulls. We found at least 3 fragmented skulls in a small trench, and that was weird. We don't know why they did that. Maybe because they wanted to inaugurate the platform, the old house platform, as an assembly site. But then we radiocarbon dated one of the skulls, and it turned out that when they did this, the skull was 800 years old. So they knew where to get really old skulls for their ritual purposes, which is just mind-boggling.
So I remember reading this in the papers. So it appears they dug up skulls to then
Yep, they
repurpose
definitely
them
did
for
that.
something new. So it's, so I mean, could we almost say that yeah, I mean, hang on. Now I've got to think about this question because it also brings up, I've got this great book from the Swedish National Museum that shows urns. So a lot of people who weren't wealthy enough to be buried were cremated,
Oh,
which
no, no,
wouldn't.
no. You got the wrong way around. It's more expensive to cremate than not to cremate.
Oh, okay. So okay.
So,
So the poor people are the ones leaving skulls behind, and if you're wealthy enough,
yeah,
then you can be burned on a pyre, and then you don't have to worry about your skull being repurposed to inaugurate a mead hall.
we've been counting graves for 100 years now in Sweden, and looking at the number of known graves versus what seems a reasonable population number. And it's quite clear that many people never got any visible burial at all. So we don't know if they fed them to the pigs or tossed them in the river or what happened to most people. The old idea that a cemetery next to a farmstead in Sweden represent everybody who lived there in the Viking period, uh, we have had to abandon that because that was the idea from Christian churchyards, where everybody has to go in the churchyard, even if somebody dies when they're half a day old, need to go into the churchyard. But that's not true. In the Viking period, people with a certain status get burial, and occasionally they will get somebody with a very low status as a gift in the grave.
Like
So
the
we,
famous Ibn Fadlan
Yeah,
story.
exactly, like the
uh,
poor slave girl
Yeah.
in Ibn Fadlan's awful story. But I
Yeah.
think he's basically telling the truth. I think he is.
so this is new to me. I didn't realize that burial practices were such a mystery, right? Like we
Well,
don't.
it's prehistory. I trained as a
Yeah.
prehistorian, and they taught me about the Viking period because Sweden has very few written sources. What we do have is these short runic inscriptions, and they all say basically the same thing. Gunnar and Sven erected this stone after Leif, their father, who was a very good man, and that's it. So we don't really have historical sources written in Sweden during Viking period. It's prehistory.
Right. Right, and
Right. We're also
we're not finding
Scandinavian.
these. Yeah, we're not finding these either, right? Because so there's a whole segment of the population during the Viking Age that is not only mute but also not in the archaeological record, and we don't know
Exactly.
how they
Yep,
disposed of those bodies.
that is
Interesting.
true. Yeah.
I think one of the things too about the is coming to my mind with when you're saying sort of going back into these graves and then sort of repurposing skulls and stuff is that, and maybe some of our regular, audience will know some of this, having, known some things about Viking Age, but I'm thinking of some of Neil Price's work about sort of the performative nature of these burials and the sort of the big production, and then also sort of contrary to, well, I mean, I was going to say in the modern era, but there's lots of cultures where, like once you bury them, then it's like rest in peace, and then you don't disturb it. And if you do, it's sort of desecration and not really seen as being, at least for some cultures, not a thing to do. But in the Viking Age, I think maybe we have some understanding that the graves would kind of be interacted with
Well, I got
more.
to tell you a dirty secret of Christianity, and that is that the availability of hallowed ground is very
Yeah,
limited.
right,
Only bishops can make hallowed ground.
right,
This means that there is no place on the planet where you are less likely to be left alone than a Christian churchyard, because they can't jump over the fence and expand towards the horizon when things get
right,
crowded. They will dig you up as soon as nobody is alive who remembers you. They will just put a new grave on top of you or partly on top of you.
right.
And there's a bone house in many Christian cemeteries where they will just toss everybody in that they find while they dig. So I would not recommend a Christian churchyard if you want to be left alone after death.
But like in the pre-Christian period in Scandinavia, there's a different set of practices and beliefs with
Well,
regard to burial.
they tend to go into graves very sort of deliberately, and as you say, that's because they want stuff from the graves. There's lots of research in how they go in to get swords, and
Yeah.
we know that they go in to get skulls, occasionally other pieces of bone, and we don't quite know. There seem to be several motivations for that. So one thing may be sort of relic hunting, in the sense of something sacred, not just remains. And the other is desecration. The big Norwegian ships' graves were all looted during a short span of time in the 900s when the Danish king had kicked the local Norwegian kings to the curb. And apparently, part of what they did to show everybody who was the boss was to break into their ancestors' ship graves and probably drag dead guys out and do demeaning things to their remains.
Yeah. That brings to mind even just practices that I've read about in ancient Egypt, them doing that too, like with
Oh
the
yeah,
the the
yeah.
the pyramids and the tombs of the pharaohs and stuff. So, um, I mean,
We
I
got
did
that
have a,
happening.
yeah, go
We
ahead.
got that happening in Stockholm in the early 1500s, where the Danish king digs up the Swedish throne pretender and has him cremated, which in 16th century theology means that he's not going to heaven.
Yeah. They wanted to make sure they dealt with that.
Yeah, I want to get rid of him once and for all.
It's like, what is it? Oliver Cromwell. I think he was posthumously executed. It's
Yep,
like,
yep,
yeah.
indeed.
So I'm thinking of timeline here on your paper. So it was 32 or 34 skulls that you looked at, right? Somewhere in there, low
Yeah,
30s.
yeah.
30.
Um, and so where do all of those place in terms of the Christianization of Scandinavia? And then what differences are you spotting based on that chronology?
Well, the Scandis are aware of Christianity, at least from the fourth century, the late Roman period. The god Balder. He
Hmm.
is a very, very poorly disguised Christ that has been borrowed into Norse polytheism. But they didn't convert to Christianity at that time. They just knew about Christianity. So when we see pagan cemeteries seas is from like 950 onward in most parts of Scandinavia. We know from some written sources that there were Christian congregations in the 800s, but they were small and sort of an urban phenomenon. Um, so basically, all of the Viking period, from Lindisfarne to Hastings, is a period of Christianization somewhere in
Yeah.
Scandinavia.
Right. I guess what I was looking for is in terms of the skull manipulations, do you see any difference?
Mm-hmm.
So like when you're dating these skulls, like there are different uses based on kind of where they're discovered and whether or not it's Christian at that point?
We don't see it in Christian churchyards. This seems to be part of the pagan polytheist view of death and of the afterlife. Yeah, not a Christian thing. But on the other hand, as soon as they turn Christian, they start buying and selling relics of saints. So you can get
Which
a
is the same
piece of Saint Anthony's shin bone, you know.
trade in body parts.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So,
You know what they did with Saint Bridget, the major 14th century religious writer? As soon as she was dead, before she had even gone cold, they boiled her to get rid of the soft parts down in Rome where she was
It's
living at the
like,
time.
come on, man, we got some bones to trade here.
Yeah, because
Chop,
Saint
chop.
Bridget was a very big deal. She had founded a very successful monastic order and was known as one of the holiest women in Christendom. So of course
Yeah.
they couldn't just leave her alone.
Is she the one that her attribute is a wheel? Or is that Catherine? Anyway,
No,
I
she wasn't martyred. Saint Bridget died of old age,
ah
but still her. So she's not depicted with an instrument of torture
yeah.
or execution. Mm.
I feel like this could have been a good skit in Norsemen that showed, from Norway. But I wish they would keep it going. It was so good. But I feel like that could have been something like they're going to a market and then it's like, hi, do you have any skulls? And then the guy's like, no, but I've got the finger of a saint.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's this joke that there was a rural church in Italy sometime in the Middle Ages who had the head of Saint John the Baptist, two copies of it, one when he was died and one from when he was 12.
Yes, the trade and all of that is, I think, well documented. I'm a medievalist also, and looking at some of the, like how many of the various, pilgrimage sites claim to have, a piece of wood from the true cross and a
Yeah,
thorn from the crown of thorns, and all of that
yeah,
is kind of
40
like,
meters tall.
yeah. And the
They
and the
fall.
monk,
Yeah.
the monks who are like sneaking off in the middle of the night to steal the relics from the other competing monastery and bring them, like,
Crazy stuff. So even
ah,
though these people were pagans, what they were doing wasn't all that weird compared to what the
yeah,
church did at the same
Right.
time.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, there's a double standard from the Christian chronicler side, right? Like they're
Yeah.
they're saying, "Oh, you barbarians and your strange practices with skulls," as they're clutching, the left femur of their patron saint.
Hmm. Hmm.
Drinking wine and eating bread and pretending it's blood and,
Yeah,
body
yeah,
and all of that. Yeah.
yeah. Do
I
you
have a
eat your
quick,
god?
no. Um, I have a question about something you said earlier. So the skulls, largely in your interpretation in the article, not to spoil it for anybody, but that there was, the slave sacrifice, quote unquote, going on, or
And
execution.
many of them seem to be in that
Yeah.
realm.
So then, I mean, when you're just sort of looking at bones in archaeology, um, I mean, when we have a written source like Ibn Fadlan, which describes it, and it's clearly this is a slave person, et cetera, right? But when you're maybe in the absence of written material and you're just looking at some bones in a grave, I mean, how are you making a determination? Say, yep, checks the box, this is a slave.
Well, if you only have the skull, it's kind of difficult because what you want to look at is the parts of the skeleton that get worn down by heavy labor. So we have several skeletons of people who have been murdered and put into the grave complete, decapitated, put into the grave. We can clearly see that these people were used as tractors. But then there's this really neat study from Norway from a place called Flakstad, where they placed um, dead people. They killed people at the graveside, and they have determined that the people who were getting killed by the graveside did not eat the same diet as the person with all the furnishings, the people with jewelry, weaponry, and stuff. They were a more plant-based, cheaper diet, and also the people who were killed at the graveside and buried without any furnishings, no jewelry, no weaponry and stuff, were not genetically related to the people, the group, the family who were being buried as landowners, as protagonists, as I say, in the grave. So there are several lines of evidence that suggest that this is not just a humble nobleman who has been stripped of all his finery and decapitated and put into a grave. This is actually a person who's always been at the bottom of the ladder.
And then as I gather, I've read also that there are some instances maybe where there's evidence of having bound hands or feet, something like
Yep, yep. Yeah, it's pretty nasty.
yeah. Oof. You know, though, actually, so this brings to mind, so also a friend of the show, David Zori. He's an archaeologist at Baylor University, and he worked in Iceland for many years. He's working in Italy now, but he and I had a conversation one time about a grave that was found, I think somewhere on a farmstead, like in, pretty remote, like Western Iceland somewhere. And it was a grave that it was a multiple grave. I think it was three people, if I remember correctly. Anyways, and one
That's
of them
rare.
was fully intact. And then I think the other two were, there was some, both of them were decapitated or there was some evidence of that kind of violence.
Yep,
And so
yep.
then the interpretation was like, oh, and there's a guy, and then his two slaves got killed to go with
Yeah,
him or
that's really
whatever.
high end because the slave was an expensive commodity unless this person was really old and worn out.
Right. Well, so then I said to him, kind of as a joke, but not really, that again, it kind of gets to this question of sort of how do you, jump to the conclusion that, these people were slaves, or at least some of them, because I said, well, okay, they're living during the Viking Age in a pretty isolated part of Western Iceland where I'm sure, just subsistence is just like really difficult. And then if, maybe some disease comes through or whatever, and that, and maybe this is betraying being an American because we live in such a ridiculous culture in this regard. But what if it is a good old fashioned murder suicide, right? What if they're like, Jesus, we're out here in the middle of freaking nowhere and we're starving to death, whatever. So I'm just gonna like, decapitate my wife and daughter or whatever, just get it over quick, and then I'm gonna kill myself, and then that's it, right? So
That's
it's
not it. Who are the people doing the burying?
yeah, that's true. Well, maybe some people found, I don't know. It was just,
Uh,
That's a
no,
good old
we
fashioned Pirates of the Caribbean scenario, Terry, right?
is
Like
it?
they
uh,
left none alive. Well, then who told the story?
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
we tend to assume that what we see in the archaeological record is sort of representative of something that happened several times. We assume that each find is not sort of this unique thing that has never happened or is very, very rarely happened.
Right.
But of course, what you suggest is not impossible at all. We know that there were murders, certainly, and there must have been suicides as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I
especially
I have an idea, Terry, to help you on that one.
okay.
What if it was a good old fashioned pagan murder suicide,
Yeah.
and then a good Christian came by and buried them?
That is possible. That is definitely possible. You could be
These
out
poor
there.
souls.
I've been to Reykholt where Snorri lived. It's out in the middle of nowhere. And so that maybe, somebody came along over there. Yeah, I don't know. Well, the other
You
thing
mean
too that I got
living in Finland is a fate worse than death?
what is yeah, right? Yeah. I mean, for sure, I think in some cases,
Uh,
yeah. These subsistence lives out there, it's like, God, I'm tired of this. I just,
no,
can't
no.
make it through one more winter wondering whether or not we're going to make it, kind of thing.
Mm.
But
There's only so much goat cheese you can eat.
yeah, right. The other thing I thought about when I was reading your article too is you have a photo in there of a skull that's got like the front part of the face or whatever that's kind of carved out there. It's absent. And that brought to mind the skull that David and Jesse found in Mosfell in Iceland. That was very clearly a skull that had a similar kind of injury, not to the front of the face. I think it was more to the back, but it was interpreted as, a violent act with an axe. This person had just been, bashed in the head with an axe. And I was wondering if that could have been the case with the skull that you have in your article, that it wasn't part of any kind of ritual, whatever, but it was just simply an injury that they got their face
No,
bashed.
no, no. There's no battle injury that removes the front of your face like this. That you can only do that to somebody who isn't moving around and isn't defending themselves. So we have many examples of quite well preserved decapitations where they've put somebody on their flat on their face and chopped off their head. Occasionally they will miss and sort of chop next to their neck and have to go
Ugh.
several times. Yeah. So I believe that the skull you're referring to has been modified for a purpose we don't know because we don't have another exactly similar skull. But as I write in the article, I think there's a huge material of this kind of stuff just sitting, waiting to be discovered because we need to sort of know that they do this with skulls to think about it that way. Otherwise, there's this idea that there are double graves. Okay, two dead people, fine. But if they're cremated, what that means is that you have a bag of bone that looks like granola. And when you look at each piece of them, you find out, oh, here are fragments of two skulls, not just one skull. Well, does that mean that there were two entire people here, or does your granola bag represent one complete person who is the protagonist of the burial plus somebody's head? So I hope that somebody's going to pick up this ball and run with it after I look through the literature.
Yeah, I was interested too in the connection to honor that you mentioned in there. And it brought to mind, I can't remember the name of the place now, but what's that burial? It's fairly famous now, I think in England, where there were about like what, 50 Viking warriors that were executed
Yeah,
by
yeah.
decapitation and sort of
The
think, okay.
St. Bryce's Day Massacre, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I think there
somewhere.
was a different one. I think there's a different one. Oh, dang, now I can't remember. But anyway, it's very clear that, they were all killed as probably the losing end of some kind of a battle or whatever.
Mm.
And, to think that, yeah, okay, for them, then that was like the most dishonorable way to really prove that you were the losers here
Well,
is,
it's the permanent demobilization.
yeah, right,
Mm.
right. In a way to send a message.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, as
And
well.
the weirdest thing is that they actually found one of these man's half brother in a burial in Denmark and managed to identify them with DNA. What are the odds? So
Yeah.
they were running DNA on various Viking skeletons, and they just realized, hey, these two guys, one from this mass burial in southern England and one from a completely normal grave in Denmark, they are very close kin. They
Yeah.
must be half brothers. Yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
amazing. And
Yeah,
they put them in
they're
the same display case. They brought the skeleton over from England
Oh,
and exhibited these two guys
nice.
reunited.
Yeah, well,
Wait, is that the one that they were saying that it was potentially fratricide, like the battle that was fought was between them? No, there was one that I did
Oh,
must have been 2 years ago. I found a study that I put up that I wrote about on my blog, and the conclusion was that it had been fratricide. I'm probably thinking of something else, but they had displayed the two bodies next to each other, and then I made a meme out of it where it's just like they're displayed right next to each other, and they'd obviously not liked each other because they killed each other. And so I put little blurbs saying, like I still hate you, after, after 1,000 years.
oh yeah.
I can't remember. It was too long ago, but it was a niche study. But these are probably yeah. Well, this goes back to what we've talked a lot about, Terry, with other folks, which is these ultimately are very small groups of people exercising a disproportionate amount of influence outside of their homeland, right? So the fact that they're related makes a lot of sense because we're
Oh, yeah.
not picking from a very diverse gene pool, at least at first. It diversifies over the course of the Viking Age. So certain studies have shown.
right.
And also, if you look at the written history, you know that the Danelaw in England and Denmark is the same, ruled by the same king in the early 11th century. So it isn't far-fetched to think that they were bopping to and fro between England and Denmark. We know them too.
Yeah. Yeah. The other part of the article was not the slave, but the sacrificing, which I mean, Leszek, he's been on the podcast a couple of times and has talked about that. And like
Yeah, yeah.
certain of these sites in Poland, where there's like lakes, for instance, that are just full of, Viking Age weaponry and stuff that, so
Hmm.
talk a little bit about that. So what,
Yeah, Leszek has this excellent paper title. It's titled the Headless Norsemen, which is pretty
nice.
good. Yeah, yeah,
That's awesome. Oh my God, that's
yeah.
going to be the title of this episode.
Well, people have been sacrificing bits of humans and entire humans for thousands of years in Scandinavia. So we know that they've been doing it at least since the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. But the thing that I find stands out with the Viking period is that they're focusing very much on the skull. So we don't find entire people being sunk into sacred lakes like 500 years before. And also, there's a lot in the literature of the time in the written sources about the head being magical, like the god Mimir, who he is visiting with the Vanir, and he gets killed for some banal reason and comes back just his head. And Odin embalms Mimir's head and uses it as sort of this walkie-talkie towards the other worlds. So Mimir still speaks. The head is still talking to Odin. And then we have a a part of a human skull from southern Denmark where they've written a message to Odin in runes. So they're praying to Odin to please end an illness, to make somebody well from an illness. And they're writing this message on a piece of somebody's skull. Clearly not the one who's sick, somebody else.
Yeah, I actually showed that picture to my students in my Viking class.
So heads are definitely magical too. It's not just a way to demean someone or to show them as a grave gift, but the head itself also has magical properties.
Yeah, I asked Matthias about that and about this article too. So Matthias Nordvig, he's at UC Boulder. He's Danish, but he specializes in Viking age or Norse mythology, folklore, etc. And I said, I shared your article with him, and it's like, what's your first thought about what's going on here? And then that was that one word answer, Mimir.
Yeah.
Is that the only example of using skulls in the saga literature? Do we have any other examples that might help inform us of what they might have been doing?
No, there are other ones. There's one story from the Orkneys where there's a battle against a Scottish chieftain, and they chop his head off and tie his head to their saddle and ride home whooping because they won. We don't know how historically accurate this is, but definitely in the Celtic context, the Celtic speaking context, where people were doing really weird stuff with the skulls in the first millennium BC, they're also talking about it in Celtic literature. Celtic literature is full of these really weird things. It is written down during the Middle Ages, so there's this long, endless conversation about what it says about the Iron Age, really, how much it says about medieval ideas about the Iron Age. But there's something called a brain ball in Celtic studies, and apparently what you do is you kill a mighty foe, and you take his brain out and mix it with quicklime, the limestone powder, and you form this into a ball which will solidify because the brains react with the quicklime, and then you get an excellent magic weapon. You can throw it with a sling at people, and it will never miss, and it will kill them. It's great stuff. Everybody needs a brain ball.
Oh my god!
Yeah. It's pretty ugly, but the Scandies do not seem to have twigged that. But still, there are some weird stories. Of course, now we have people drinking from skull cups, but that's not specifically in a Viking context. That's continental Germanic speakers in sort of heroic legendary. We're basically in a Wagner opera when people are drinking from skull cups. So there's no evidence that they did that in Scandinavia.
I seem to remember, I may be remembering wrong, maybe I'm cross, but at the siege of Paris in 845, I believe there were, well, so first of all, there were women there, and they hanged bodies from a tree outside of Paris, like as a means to scare the population of Paris, right? And didn't they hurl heads, or was that somebody else that hurled heads? Who did the hurling of heads?
Oh, if I only knew. I'm not an historian. I'm just a poor Scandi prehistorian who knows very little about the siege of Paris in 845.
Oh,
But
I'll have to look it up and report
I'll
back
grant
because
you this, that the men of Paris would be extremely disgruntled if there were no women in Paris. So I think that's correct.
yeah. Well, no, I'm talking about they were women that had joined the Viking fleet. And what they did was they hanged bodies from a tree outside, and then they wailed at the city, right, to freak them out, basically. It's just a good old fashioned psychological warfare. But it seems to me they also like hurled heads or something like that. I can't remember. I'll have to go back, and I haven't looked at it in years, so I'll have to go back and take a look. I did not include that. I mean, I did include the women wailing in my book because I did write about it, but.
It's an old truth that when you get invaded, every woman should really fast get themselves a civilized officer boyfriend from the invaders, because otherwise things can really get very bad if you want to survive. So,
yeah,
officer boy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then things get really, really bad when your side kicks the invaders out, but that's a later problem.
Yeah. Be more like Coco Chanel.
What?
Yeah, yeah. Did you know that?
Wasn't she famous for that? She like, the Paris was invaded and she immediately had like three Nazi boyfriends, and then after the war she was accused of being a collaborationist and stuff like that.
I've heard the stories. Yeah, I very rarely wear Chanel, so I don't really know. But
I mean, it didn't hurt her
um,
business, obviously.
no,
Here's my new scent, German officer.
Oh man.
Pour
Oh
homme.
jeez. Ah.
uh,
Oh, so the other thing I wanted to ask then about too, I'm thinking of, I mean, just cross-culturally. I mean, we're talking about this in the context of the Viking Age, and it's like woo woo weirdo Vikings or something. But I mean, this is something you can find in lots of cultures throughout history. And I was thinking about some of the stuff that I used to know about back in the day when I had to teach some of this, like the Inca, that so these cultures that practice ancestor worship and having either like a skull or even like a kind of mummified body or part of it, right? Like this is kind of like there that's sort of still part of your life that definitely also would be sort of well, not sort of, but like consulted in times of, important things like we're going to go to war or whatever. And I mean, I think we know that there is a sense of some type of ancestor worship, at least in pre-Christian Scandinavia in the Viking Age. And so I wonder if any of the skull or the, body part type of stuff had anything to do with that from time to time.
it seems that the people getting decapitated and when they fooled around with their skulls were low status individuals, so not your revered grandpa.
Yeah.
Communicating with your ancestors in Scandinavia is largely a question of sitting on mounds. So the
Right.
mound represents the continuity. It's even used as an instrument for tax purposes in medieval law. That if you have a real cemetery with a lot of mounds behind your house, then you're tax exempt because you can document that we've been sitting here for hundreds of years. This
Right.
is not a recently established farm on land that belongs to the king.
Right.
So I would say that in Viking period Scandinavia, people are not keeping their dear forefathers indoors. They are under the mound out at your family cemetery because they don't have central churchyards mostly. They're next to the farm.
Yeah.
But I know that in New Guinea, still in the 1950s, in the men's houses in New Guinea highlands, the people would use their men would use their forefathers' skulls as pillows because it kept them from bad dreams.
Oh,
So it's useful against nightmares to have a trusted ancestor's skull as a pillow in the men's.
and that's recent.
Oh yeah, yeah. Then they were very traditional up basically until Star Trek.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me. I think it isn't it Jared Diamond that did all that work in Papua New Guinea. For his, anyways. Because I was just going to ask, like, well, what looks like it probably changed all of this. I mean, I would have to guess with the Viking Age, it's going to be Christianity. I mean, that starts to say, hey, that's not cool.
Yeah, that is true. But I don't think we should imagine sort of any cultural colonialism across Scandinavia. Christianity was chosen by the Scandinavian rulers themselves.
Right.
And we know that highborn Scandinavian women were very interested in Christianity. So I think they sort of chose to leave the old times behind. The reason that Snorri Sturluson writes his Edda, his handbook for Old Norse poetry, is that he has realized that nobody really remembers this stuff anymore.
Right.
Nobody understands the illusions in old poetry, and I think this is really important. I need to write it down before it goes away. So the Christian Scandinavians of the 12th century are not super different from the pagan ones of the early 11th century. It's the same families. Occasionally, they will flip flop between Christianity and paganism, but eventually, it just wasn't cool anymore to be a pagan. So they were nobody beat paganism out of the Scandinavians. They decided
Right.
to leave behind.
Well, at least in the Icelandic situation. I mean, they did have a little short list there of the pagan practices they were still allowed to do for a little period of
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
But
As long as you did it discreetly.
yeah, but it wasn't, none of it was like you can keep the heads of or you can,
No,
chop the
no,
heads off your
no.
slaves if you want to still for a while.
That's funny also why we don't have slavery anymore in Scandinavia. When it is functionally made illegal in the 14th century, what they actually decide is that you're not no longer allowed to enslave anyone with Christian parents. So they don't have any sort of objections in principle against slavery. That's fine as long as you don't enslave anybody with Christian parents. And by the 1300s in Scandinavia, the nearest source of people who did not have Christian parents were like the Sami and from the far north, or you could go to inland Estonia and look for them, which people did not do. Um, so that's hundreds of years after they all became Christian that slavery finally just peters out. And I always tell people that in Scandinavia, nobody knows how much slave ancestry they have because these
Mhm.
slaves look like everybody else. So we
Yeah.
don't have the current American situation um, because we do know that we all have slave
Yeah,
blood.
exactly.
But how much or from where? No, nobody remembers.
Yeah, I know when I'm teaching, some of the stuff that, so the white supremacist, stuff that
Oh yeah,
people
yeah.
latch onto, right? And it, taking the baton from Hitler and then sort of like still buying into this kind of idea. And I've had people respond to me like things I've posted online about the Viking Age, and like they're all like, "Yeah, Norway has the purest gene pool," blah blah, blah. And I'm like, "Yeah, dude, like, the Vikings were slavers. All slavers throughout history have sex with their slaves, period.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that by definition means you're starting to mix it up, like from
And
moment one."
it's in the sagas as well, where there can be the situation where a free man has a child by a slave woman, and
Yeah,
this child turns out to be really promising, and he would just treat this is my favorite kid. He was born out of wedlock, but I'm pagan. I don't really care.
yeah,
This is a very promising young man. I'm going to bring him on my Viking expeditions.
yeah.
And they didn't have an idea of racial purity at all. Um, so that's just poor historical knowledge. But
Yeah.
uh,
Well, the latest one that I got into a fight online about, you saw it, Terry, the one about the whole there were no Muslim Vikings, and then the conservative right are saying, no, there's no evidence for it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, we don't have anything that tells us explicitly that a Viking. Now, first of all, let's define Viking. That's what I was telling people. I was like, we need to define what that actually means, right? So let's just assume we go with the people who left home to rove, the pirates, right? So let's say
yeah,
that's a Viking. We don't know that one of them practiced Islam on the side. We also don't know that one didn't, right? But then I put the plausible case together that they were raiding, far east, down to far east they were trading, and then far west they were raiding in Andalusian Spain. And now we know that there were interactions because we have Ibn Fadlan, we have Al Ghazal, we have Al Turishi, excuse my pronunciation.
Artucci?
Yeah. Anyway, but there's a couple of them, right? They sent embassies to go study the Vikings, right? Because they were
yeah,
curious about them. Oh, well, who are these people coming all the way here? So I said, and especially with, say, for example, the sack of Seville, where they go all the way up the Guadalquivir, they take Seville. They hung out for like a couple of days, which gave time for the emir to do his army and everything. But it's plausible that they took slaves there, right? And then we have in I think it's the Irish one of the Irish annals. I can't remember which one, but I'd have to go back into my list of sources. But there's an example of, for example, Bjorn Ironside showing up in Ireland with slaves from Spain. So it's plausible that Muslims were captured, enslaved, and then sent over to Ireland, and then shipped all the way to say Sweden. So that's plausible, right? And then if you think about that scenario, now we're talking about a very mixed gene pool, because again, as you said, Terry, when you have slaves, men will be men, right? And maybe they would have had a promising young man born from that union, and then, but would he have practiced Islam? We don't know. It's all conjecture, but it's plausible. So this idea of absolutely no, it could not, and that's what the people were trying to say was absolutely no way.
Are
because
you
they're
familiar with
yeah.
novel Bengtson's novel, The Longships?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a scene there in the first book where the protagonist has been enslaved among the Moors of Spain. He's been a galley slave, rowing, chained to an oar for years, and he finally managed to escape. Him and his buddies, they steal a ship and they decide to go home to Denmark. And they're like, okay, we've been Muslims now for several years. Who are we going to sacrifice to get a safe trip? So we talk this over, and they end up, before they leave Spain, they sacrifice to Jesus, the North Sea god, and Allah. And it works. They get Denmark just fine. So it turns out it was the right decision. Neither Jesus nor Allah nor the North Sea god was angry. They were all happy.
We'll play hedge our bets, right?
Yeah, covering your bases there.
Yeah. I had I have that in let's see, which novel did I bring that character in? I think my second novel in the Saga of Hastings series. There's a slave that's brought back from Spain by Bjorn Ironsides, actually, funny enough. And he proves himself as a capable fighter. And so they bring him on as part of the crew, basically saying, "Wow, he sort of gets his freedom." I keep it ambiguous because I'm like, it's one of those they didn't have written contracts and stuff like that, so there's kind of a performative. Oh yeah, hey, he fights really well, and then he ends up being one of the closest like defenders of the main character as he goes through because he's fighting three different factions at the same time. So it's interesting how somebody could for me as a historical fiction writer, I think it is plausible that somebody could have worked their way into it, especially in an honor-bound society where what matters is what you do, not who you are. And so if you can show that you have prowess in battle and that you're loyal, right? I think you could find a place in that society versus in a Christian society, for example. It's like, well, no, you have to be Christian. Well, I'm Muslim. Okay, well, then you can go back to wherever you came from, right? There's that separation.
And every free person in the 9th and 10th century Scandinavia handled Muslim coinage with lots of Arabic writing on it. So the contacts are, as you already described, they're quite extensive. There's no way to say that was never any Muslim in Scandinavia. I don't really know why anybody would want to argue the issue at all.
Exactly.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah.
it's that
They're
conservative right
motivated
wing.
by modern xenophobia.
Yeah,
That's all.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly. And even just modern conceptions, at least here in the United States, of race and,
Oh yeah.
having more of an understanding of it in, post-Columbian era, and how that changes. And then they don't understand that you can't sort of project a modern idea about racism back, 1200 years because people thought about those things differently.
Well,
Yeah,
that's where it gets
and they
hairy with
will.
the. Oh, go ahead.
No, and they will think differently about it a few hundred years in the future. We're just all sitting where we're sitting along the timeline. We can't escape.
Yeah.
It gets hairy with the sagas of the Vinland sagas, where they come to North America and the way they treat the Skraelings. It's a little concerning because it does show that there is a dehumanizing aspect to Norse society, but in certain facets, right? Especially the Greenland Norse did not like the Skraelings, did not treat them as humans. Well, but if you see the slavery in general, I mean that's a trend. But to your point, Terry, I mean we have our modern kind of lens on how they would have seen it, like how we see race is how we project how they would have seen race,
Yeah.
versus when you read carefully, it's more of a uh, tribal thing, right?
I think they probably extended their attitudes towards Inuit because they'd already been living in Greenland for a long time before they
Yeah.
went to Nova Scotia. So
Yeah.
they were probably just treating them as badly as they had treated Inuit. And also, the word Skraeling is funny because I think the etymology is basically someone who is ill, someone who is weak. And this suggests that they were giving them smallpox and flu and stuff that they weren't familiar with. But of course, they would seem weak.
Yeah.
Try smallpox.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
I remember and I don't know, maybe because I had a kid a little too old maybe, because my brain is scrambled from I have an almost 2 year old. My sleep hasn't been good since he was born. But anyways, so I sometimes I'm like
Congratulations.
I'm ironclad, like I remember this, and I seem to remember a study that came out maybe 20 years ago. I think I read it in college, and it had something to do with there was a big outbreak of something, some kind of disease that wiped out a significant swath of the population in the Americas pre-Columbian, like as a pre-Columbian kind of pandemic, if you will. I seem to remember it, but every time I try to research it, it's nowhere to be found. I haven't been able to
I
find
think
it again.
this sounds a lot like what happened in North America long before the Europeans came there, because Columbus got off the boat in the Caribbean, and immediately there was this wave of contagion moving in both directions, down South America and up towards North America. So even the passenger pigeons have been implicated in this. You know, these enormous flocks of birds that would darken the sky up until like 1900, they were probably an effect of the fact that enormous areas of Native American farmland had been laid waste by these epidemics a couple of hundred years before, creating a habitat that the passenger pigeon just happened to thrive on. But by the time that Cortes comes up into North America, people have already been dying, and the population he meets is severely decimated from what it had been.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
'cause
that way in with Cortez in Mexico as well. I mean, they're able to go there and take over pretty quickly, but it's because the population was already severely weakened from
Yeah, yeah,
disease.
hmm.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Ugly stuff.
The the one I seem to remember, maybe I'm probably remembering wrong, but it was basically kind of the aha was like, oh, maybe they got sick from the Norse contacts, right? Like
Possible.
the
Yeah.
Scandinavians came in, spread those diseases, and then it spread out through North America. I,
Hmm.
but like I said, every time I've tried to look for that study, I could have sworn it was in like a National Geographic like 20 years ago, but I just can't seem to find it. It's just gone. So it must just be one of those, you know how fickle memory is, just one of those fragmentary
Yeah.
misremembrances.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to get back to the skull thing. I want to, in your estimation, I mean, so when you back out to like, the 30,000 foot view and, kind of look at these sorts of things cross-culturally and, we can dial in and go, oh man, like those weirdo Vikings were doing, that's sort of creepy. But then when you go like, oh, look at human history, it's like, oh, it's not that weird, right? I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, people will do the damnedest things. They really will. But I think it's more shocking that they killed them than whatever they did with their heads after they killed them. I'm a materialist, so you do your thing with somebody's skull. That won't hurt anybody. It might smell, but
Yeah.
it's way more sad that these people could effectively decide their life and death for their slaves the same way you did for goat. But that's people for you. It's happening today.
Yeah, right. I mean, well, that's the history of, yeah, humanity. I mean, you can find
Mm.
that everywhere.
You just define the other people out as not quite human, and then boom, you've got Auschwitz.
Yeah. Although I don't know. I mean, I think for some people too, the death, I mean, but then the what you do after it just sort of adds an extra layer of creep factor. I'm like remembering like years ago in the United States, there was this, he was a serial killer, I think, but
Uh,
his name was Jeffrey Dahmer, and he like
yep,
killed
yep.
these people, right? And then parted them out and like kept that stuff in his freezer and was like doing all this other weird and like eating it, part
But
of it,
but
I
but
think.
but Jeffrey Dahmer was insane, so
Right.
so that's kind of okay. He didn't know better. He acted according to his own whims. But most of the atrocities committed by people are committed by people who are not insane, and that's way more concerning.
Yeah, well, nowadays, I mean, if we can get to the point of being able to diagnose that, I mean, you can't do that for the Viking Age. The people who did those things could have been insane. We don't have any way of knowing.
No, but I think the cases I've looked at were probably sort of socially sanctioned. This was not some dirty secret of some crazy person on the margins of society. This was they were hanging heads off the palisade of major towns. You
Yeah,
came to Dublin in the Viking period. There were guys on the palisade. Hello.
yeah. Well, that too is
So,
not unusual though, right? In human history. I mean, even
oh
Rome's lining the road with people being crucified and
yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah,
so
did they
Such
do 50 miles? Like they after they took out who was it? Spartacus?
yeah, it was during the Servile Wars. Yeah, and
Yeah.
they're like, yeah, because there's several thousand slaves that are rising up.
contributes to the party atmosphere, I guess.
Oh
Or
God.
or maybe it's 50 kilometers. It was 50 kilometers on the roads. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely well when you live in a time where it's it's an age of violence and everybody's trying to kill you,
Yeah.
it behooves you to
Also, if you have a
warn them.
slave, an economy based on slavery, and the slaves start getting uppity, then you might feel the need to make an example of 50 kilometers of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when those slaves are winning battles against,
Mm,
known generals.
mm, mm,
Yeah. The Spartacus rebellion is fascinating actually. If you really dig
mm,
into it, it's pretty cool.
mm.
Yeah. Well, so I promised 3 jokes to our listeners about skulls. I've landed 2 so far. I hope you've been keeping track. So number three. So I guess we could say, so you know who was a good skull collector is the Predator. Remember
Yeah,
that?
huh?
He would grab the
I,
bodies and then he'd collect the skulls as trophies and then he would like clean them
yeah,
and
he
make them
was kind
nice
of a
and pretty.
trophy hunter. That was
He's
his
hmm
motivation.
so so going back to Terry's article about Tupac could have been a Viking, the Predator could have been a Viking.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Actually, one of my students just asked me
Ba-dum-bum.
that in our last week in our last class. My student, he said, "Do you ever watch, like fiction related things that kind of are related to the Viking Age, or do you just stick to like, the documentary or whatever?" I'm like, "No, I like the fiction and stuff or whatever." But that's exactly where he went. He's like, "You ever seen Predator?" I'm like,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I watched it for the first time when I was like 48 or something.
Well, it's a good movie. It's
It is,
entertaining.
yeah. And did you watch Prey?
"Pray."
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
No.
it's a really good update. It's a really good
hmm
update.
They did a really good job portraying the fur trappers. They were
Yep.
French. Yeah, it's
And
funny. Most
speaking
people
really,
around
really
here,
bad French.
it's Quebecois French. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's I'm sorry, sorry, people in Quebec. Your French is not really really bad, but it is Quebec. Well, the funny thing about Quebecois, so I understand Quebecois a little bit better than I'd say the average French person because that accent comes from the patois of Western France, which is where my family's from. The people who went to North
Oh,
America came out of the port of Saint-Nazaire. And it was after the War of Vendée, you had a big exodus of people that went into North
oh
America.
wow.
And the one that gets
Not
me,
often that you encounter an American with such a good French accent as yours.
Well,
well,
because he's half French.
I'm also French. Yeah, when I
That's
go
why he's
to
moving to
France,
France.
yeah,
Oh,
I
I
go
see.
to I go to France and I don't tell people that I'm American. But then after a while, they kind of start. I think it's my sense of humor and also the fact that I'm 6'3" and 220 pounds. They're like, this does not look French. You're a bit too big. Do you do rugby? No, nope, no rugby.
That's neat.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
well,
I
so
got my
what are
three
you
jokes.
what
Sorry.
are you
Go ahead.
working on next, or what are you working
I'm
on now?
waiting for the jokes about giving head. Where are they?
Oh, oh my God.
He went there. He went there. Yes.
I'm Swedish.
This has got some good one-liners, man. I'm thinking
Yeah.
people do the darndest things and
Oh my
granola
goodness.
bags with
Yeah.
human bodies
Well,
in them.
that's the joke about Father's Day, right? Is what do you want for Father's Day? And you can go back to the Viking Age. Here's your Father's Day gift, and then she hands him a skull.
Yep, absolutely.
Ooh, okay. Ooh.
Boo. Yeah. All right. On that note,
But what I'm working on at the moment is we've just finished a big metal detector survey of this amazing site on Gotland, where
Oh.
this is a bit older. There's Viking period stuff there as well, but that's not why we came there. In like 500 AD, in the decades around there, they have been sacrificing just hundreds and hundreds of little neck rings made from copper alloy. So they're not super expensive, but they're very finely made, and they're chopping them up into little bits, and they're sort of barbecuing them. So they're slightly molten, but not so they become impossible to classify. And then they're just spreading them over acres and acres of land everywhere around this farmstead. So weird. Along with a few exclusive things like small gold objects, Roman silver coins, and stuff. So Gotland is known for its Viking period silver hoards. And
Right.
for that reason, it has been completely off limits to metal detector surveys, except for little controlled ones by professionals. So this is a really big deal that we got permission to bring 11 skilled amateurs over to Gotland for a 3-day fieldwork gig. And we came home with like 300 finds for 3 days. Just endless stuff, really big.
Yeah, we have a
That's
previous
fun.
episode already, gosh, what, CJ, probably a year and a half ago or something. Octavia Randolph, who's an American author, but she's lived on Gotland and Visby since the late 1990s. And
Oh, really?
she's amazing. The episode is she's like the ambassador for Gotland, man. She just,
Uh-huh.
knows so
It
much
is
about,
an amazing place. I
yeah,
highly
yeah.
recommend it. Medieval Week, not least. Medieval Week is really nice.
Yeah, because she talked to us about what is the little trope there of like rabbits, making their little burrows,
Yeah,
just like
Well, that was
kicking up
a
stuff because it's just so under the surface, just
yeah, they
right
do. And
yeah.
the local paper is so blasé that they will have the headline, "This year's hoard has been found," because they know that there's going to be a new hoard, a silver hoard from the Viking period every summer, and it's not even front page news.
Well, and
I,
also one of the Gotland picture stones actually has pictures of decapitated bodies
Yep,
with the
exactly.
heads
Yeah,
removed. Yeah.
yeah.
as
And
the
sadly, no captions. So
Yeah,
you just have to
right. Well,
interpret the picture.
as the Octavia told us about how you can't dig deeper than 3 or 6 inches, or something like that, um, even in your own yard without an official observer, because it's so likely you're going to actually dig something up.
Yeah,
And yeah,
in
that was
Visby
the
that is true
yeah.
because Visby is sitting on cultural layers from several hundred years of urban life. But Gotland has two big sources of income, and that's tourism and carrots. And in order to get those carrots out, I think might need to go more than 6 inches into your field.
yeah.
Well, those if they're well cultivated fields, then it's probably like, oh, we know there's nothing here. Like we've been cultivating this for a
Oh, no,
while.
no, no, no. The
Yeah.
cultivated fields are the best because everything is sitting in the topsoil because it's been
Get
plowed
churning it
around.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
That's where
Oh,
the good stuff is. Yeah.
Yep.
interesting.
You're spotting all the farmers' fields in the year at the time of the year. Excuse me, my husband and I have a Christmas tree farm, and my husband just finished doing that a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
We're
Huh.
tilling all the soil and getting ready to
Hmm.
plant the new little trees. And yeah, and then all the birds show up, right? Because like all the, like the worms.
Earthworms.
Yep,
Yeah,
everything. So it's like when you see all that activity, that's when you know, okay, we need to go metal detecting over there.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So anyway, wow. Well, so it all sounds exciting what you get up to.
yeah, yeah. It's good fun. Most of Swedish archaeology, if you have funding at all for archaeology in Sweden, it's for highway projects and railway projects.
Yeah.
And the people working on them are extremely skillful field archaeologists, but they very rarely get to dig where they want to dig.
Yeah.
Because the developers pay them to tell them beforehand where the stuff is. And then they design the highway or the railway to avoid the site.
Yeah.
So that's kind of annoying. You always end up 400 meters from where you actually do want to dig. And that's the only way to get paid to do archaeology in Sweden. I
That's
haven't been in that business.
that's
Hmm.
interesting because I did hear Charlotte, and I can't pronounce her last name, but what is it, Hedenstierna Jonsson at University of Uppsala, on a podcast talking about that, and they asked, because she spent so many years working in Birka and stuff, but then they were asking about, sort of new digs and this and that, and she's like, we're really not digging anything new other than if it's related to like, some kind of a project that has to get done because that's the only way
Yeah,
that,
that's the only way to get funding.
yeah,
So in Sweden, basically, if a site is really unique and super interesting, it's hard to get money to excavate there because that place will never get hit by a highway project. You will
yeah,
avoid it at all costs.
yeah, yeah. Interesting.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, well, I don't know. Did you get all your answers about the skulls, CJ?
I think I did. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah.
Well,
We
thanks for
appreciate it.
Anytime.
having
This is
me,
really
and you can get back to me whenever you like on email if there's any questions you want clarifications.
Yeah, maybe when you're getting ready to publish your stuff or whenever you feel comfortable talking about the stuff on Gotland, that would be cool.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, sure. I just finished the fieldwork report this morning, and I'm waiting for my collaborators to check it for me, so I don't make any stupid mistakes. But I'm always happy to come back and talk to you guys. And
Great.
Okay.
if you swing by Stockholm, then I shall be your native guide.
Ah, he might now that he's moving back to France.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
coming
yeah.
back to the EU.
Yeah, yeah. I
That's
plan on doing
excellent.
some traveling around, and so yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. You may be hearing from
that's,
me.
I hope you won't be evicted by ICE, so you'll be allowed to leave the country at your own volition.
Oh yeah, I should be able to. I have a U.S. passport, so but also the French one. Yeah, it's a one-way ticket to France, so I have to have the French one out.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Très bien.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, that would be great. So yeah, after we kind of reconvene in the fall, then we would
Let's
love
stay
to,
in touch.
yeah, we'll love to talk to you again.
All right.